The first time it occurred to poor Millie that something might really be wrong was, on the face of it, perfectly harmless and commonplace. Uncle Stephen, the boy's great-uncle, had found the words, conventional though the words were. "You're much too big a boy to make messes like that, Rodney. And you too, of course, Angus." Angus wasn't making a mess, Rodney had retorted. "There's no need to bite his head off too. Keep quiet, boy, and clean yourself up," Uncle Stephen had rejoined, exactly as if he had been father to the lads, and a good and proper father also. In reality, however, Uncle Stephen was a bachelor. "I'll take you up to the bathroom, Rodney," Millie had intervened. "If you'll excuse us for a few moments, Uncle Stephen." Uncle Stephen had made no effort to look pleasant and social. Rather, he had grated with irritation. When Millie took Rodney out of the room, Uncle Stephen was glaring at her other son, defying him to move, to speak, to breathe, to exist except upon sufferance. It was certainly true that the boys lacked discipline. They were a major inconvenience and burden, overshadowing the mildest of Millie's joys. Even when they were away at school, they oppressed her mind. There was nowhere else where they were ever away, and even the headmaster, who had been at London University with Phineas, declined to accept them as boarders, though he had also declined to give any precise reason. When Millie had looked very pale, he had said, as gently as he could, that it was better not to enter into too much explanation. Experience had taught him that. Call it an intuition, he had experienced. Certainly it had settled the matter. She had supposed that, like so many things, the headmaster's decision might have related to the fact that the boys were twins. Twins ran in her family, and the two other cases she knew of, both much older than she was, did not seem to be happy twins. Nonetheless, until the coming of Rodney and Angus, and though she would have admitted it to few people, she had always wished she had a twin herself, a twin sister, of course. Mixed twins were something especially peculiar. She had never herself actually encountered a case, within the family or without. She found it difficult to imagine. Now, Millie no longer wished for a twin. She hardly knew any longer what she wished for, large, small, or totally fantastic. All that notwithstanding, and, of course, much, much more, Millie had never supposed there to be anything very exceptional about her situation. Most mothers had troubles of some kind, and there were many frequently encountered varieties from which she had been mercifully spared, at least so far. Think of Jenny Homeforth, whose Mikey drank so much that he was virtually unemployable. Fancy having to bring up Audrey and Olivia and Proserpina when you had always to be looking for a part-time job as well, and with everyone's eyes on you, pitying, contemptuous, no longer even lascivious. But upstairs in the bathroom, it came to Millie, clearly and consciously for the first time, that the boys were not merely too big to make messes. They were far, far too big in a more absolute sense. Rodney seemed almost to fill the little bathroom. He had spoken of Uncle Stephen biting his head off. That would have been a dreadful transaction, like. But Millie drew back from the simile. Of course, for years no one could have failed to notice that the boys were enormous, and few had omitted to refer to it, jocularly or otherwise. The new element was the hypothesis that the irregularity went beyond merely social considerations. It existed in a limbo where she and her husband, Phineas, might well find themselves virtually alone with it, and very soon. Millie had read English language and literature and knew of the theory that Lady Wilde and her unfortunate son had suffered from acromegaly. That appeared to have been something that ran in Lady Wilde's family, the LGs, because Sir William had been quite stunted. But of course there were limits even to acromegaly. About Rodney and Angus, Millie could but speculate. When all the clothes had been drawn off Rodney, she was appalled to think what might happen if ever in the future she had to struggle with him physically, as so often in the past. Re-entering the drawing room, Rodney pushed in ahead of her as he always did. Angus seized the opportunity to charge out, almost knocking her down. He could be heard tearing upstairs. She dreaded to think for what. It mattered more when her respected Uncle Stephen was in the house. She looked apologetically at Uncle Stephen and managed to smile. When her heart was in it, Millie still smiled beautifully. "Rodney," roared Uncle Stephen, "sit down properly. uncross your legs, and wait until someone speaks to you first." "He'd better finish his tea," said Millie timidly. "He no longer deserves anything. He's had his chance and he threw it away. He's a very big boy, Uncle Stephen." "You said so yourself." "Too big," responded Uncle Stephen. "Much too big." The words had been spoken again, and Millie knew they were true. Uncle Stephen and Millie talked for some time about earlier days and of how happiness was but a dream and of the disappearance of everything that made life worth living. They passed on to Phineas's lack of prospects and to the trouble inside Millie that no doctor had yet succeeded in diagnosing, even to his own satisfaction. Millie offered to show Uncle Stephen round the garden, now that it had almost stopped raining. "It's quite a small garden," she said objectively. But Uncle Stephen had produced his big, ticking watch from his waistcoat pocket, which sagged with its weight. There was this sagging pocket in all his waistcoats. It helped to confirm Uncle Stephen's identity. "Can't be done, Millie. I'm due back for a rubber at 6 and it's 5:11 already." "Oh, I'm terribly sad, Uncle Stephen. Phineas and I have raised the most enormous pelargoniums. Mainly luck, really. I should so much like you to see them." Then Millie said no more. "My loss, Millie dear. Let me embrace my sweet girl before I go." He crushed her for a minute or two, then stepped back and addressed Angus. "Stand up and give me your hand." Angus soared upwards, but kept his hands to himself. "I mean to shake your hand," bawled Uncle Stephen, in his quarterdeck manner, even though he had never mounted a quarterdeck, except perhaps on Navy Day. Angus extended his proper hand, and Uncle Stephen wrenched it firmly. When Millie and he were for a moment alone together in the little hall, something that could not happen often, Uncle Stephen asked her a question. "Have you a strap? For those two, I mean." "Of course not, Uncle Stephen. We prefer to rely on persuasion and, naturally, love." Uncle Stephen yelled with laughter. Then he became very serious. "Well, get one. And use it frequently. I've seen what I've seen in this house. I know what I'm talking about. Get two while you're about it. The Educational Supply Association will probably help you. Phineas will never use anything like that. Then you'd better consider leaving him, Millie dear, because there's trouble coming. You can always make a home with me and bring the boys with you. You know that, Millie. There's a welcome for you at any time. Now, one more kiss and I must vamoose." As soon as the front door shut, Angus, who had been watching and listening to the scene through the hole the twins had made in the upstairs woodwork, almost fell on her in every sense. Back in the drawing room, she saw that Rodney, released from thrall, had resumed his tea and had already eaten everything that had been left. Noting this, Angus began to bawl. It might be all right later, but at that hour Millie was afraid lest the neighbors intervene, Hubert and Morwenna Ellsworthy, who were ostentatiously childless. "Don't cry, Ong," said Rodney, putting his arm tightly round Angus's shoulder. "Uncle Stephen always hogs the lot. You know that." Angus's rage of weeping failed to abate. Rodney gave him a tender and succulent kiss on the cheek. "We'll go to the lavender bag," he said. "I'm still hungry too. I think I've got the worms. I expect you have as well. Race you. Ready. Steady. Go." As the race began on the spot, the picking up and clearing up for Millie to do were not confined to the tea things. The lavender bag was a cafe at the other end of the parade. It was run by the Misses Palmerston, 4 of them. It was a nice enough place in its way, and useful for the release through long lunch times and tea times of high spirits or low spirits, as the case might be. Millie went there often, and so did her friends, though soon she would have no friends. Some of them distrusted her already because they knew she had a degree. Now Millie suddenly set down the cake tray she was holding. She took care not to let the large crumbs fall to the carpet. "Oh God," gulped Millie, sinking to the edge of the settee and almost to her knees. "God, please God. What have I done to be punished? Please tell me, God, and I'll do something else." Only some outside intervention could possibly avail. She had never been very good at having things out with anyone, not even with girl friends, and Phineas had undoubtedly weakened her further. All the same, something simply had to be attempted, however recurrent, however foredoomed. To make a special occasion of it, she put on a dress, even though it had to be a dress that Phineas would recognize. At least, she supposed he must. The boys were still rampaging about at the lavender bag, which in the summer remained open for late snacks until 8 p.m. They liked to run round the tables wolfing everything that others had left on plates and in saucers. The Mrs. Palmerston merely looked on with small, lined smiles. Simultaneously, the boys were normal children and flashing young blades. "Why should you feel at the end of your tether?" inquired Phineas. "After all, every day's your own. Certainly far more than my days are mine." If only one could give him a proper drink before one attempted to talk seriously with him, that is, to talk about oneself. "It's the boys, Phineas. You don't know what it's like being at home with them all day. The holidays won't last forever. After only a week, I'm almost insane." She tried to rivet his attention. "I mean it, Phineas." Millie knew extremely well that she herself would be far more eloquent and convincing if Phineas's abstinence had not years ago deprived her too, though with never the hint of an express prohibition, but rather the contrary. When she was reading, she had learned of the Saxons never taking action unless the matter had been considered by the council, first when sober and then when drunk. It was the approach that was needed now. "What's the matter with the boys this time?" asked Phineas. Millie twitched. "They're far too tall and big." "How long is it since you looked at them, Phineas?" "Being tall's hardly their fault. I'm tall myself and I'm their father. You're tall in a different way. You're willowy. They're like two great Red Bulls in the house. I'm afraid we have to look to your family for that aspect of it. Consider your Uncle Nero, if I may venture to mention him. I don't like him being called that, but you can't deny he's bulky. There's no one of his build anywhere up my family tree, as far as I am aware. For better or for worse, of course. There are more troublesome things than sturdiness, especially in growing boys." Millie did not have to be told. She had often reflected that Phineas, seeping tiredly over the settee at the end of the day's absence, was like an immensely long anchovy, always with the same expression at the end of it, and in the next bed it was, of course, far worse. "Then you're not prepared to help in any way? Suppose I have a breakdown?" "There's be no danger of that, Millie, if only you could persuade yourself to eat more sensibly. Perhaps you could persuade your sons of that. I shall try to do when they are older. At present, they are simply omnivorous, like all young animals. It is a stage we go through and then try to pass beyond." "Then you do admit that they're like animals?" "I suppose it depends partly upon which animals." Millie knew perfectly well, however, that for her they were not like animals, or not exactly, and despite what she had said to Phineas, they were like something far more frightening. "Uncle Stephen was very upset by them before you came home." Phineas merely smiled at her. He had all but finished the lactose drink which he consumed every evening before their meal. "Uncle Stephen said we ought to see what discipline could do." "Discipline would hardly prevent the boys growing up," observed Phineas. And it was still a matter of hours before it was even sunset. The boys could be heard approaching in what had become their usual way. They stumbled in through the open French window. "Got any good grub in your pockets, Dad?" shouted Rodney. With a smile, Phineas produced a dun-colored bag of huge, gluey toffees, something he would never have put into his own mouth. The boys fell into chairs and began to pass the bag from hand to hand. "Mum going to cook supper soon?" "I expect so, Angus." "What's it going to be, Dad?" "Better ask her, Rodney." It was not, as he knew, that he aimed to instill manners. It was merely that he could not care less. One thing Millie had particularly resented was that every single evening she had to produce two very different meals, and then be silently sneered at if she herself chose the more exciting one, or consumed any scrap of it. Now Millie was past resentment. Panic had taken its place. "We need food, Dad. You don't want us to outgrow our strength." "Besides, we're twins," said Angus. It was hard to see where that came in, but Millie knew quite well that somewhere it very much did. Everything was fundamentally her own fault. She was perfectly well aware of that. Everything always is one's own fault. "Our reports come yet, Dad?" "I don't think so, Rodney." "You can't put them on the fire this time, because it's summer, but you will put them down the topos?" "Unopened, Dad," put in Angus. He was half on his feet again, and redder than ever. "Unopened, Dad," insisted Rodney, though perhaps more calmly. Torn up, if you like, said Angus. We shall have to see, said Phineas. Shan't we? When the time comes, that is. He rose from the settee and walked quietly from the room. Oh, Mum, said Rodney, jumping up and down. Do get on with it. The patience of the young is soon exhausted. We're hungry, Angus confirmed. Remember, we only had salad for lunch. Muck, we called it. It had been a cut-up which Phineas had not eaten the previous evening. One could not simply throw it away, and Phineas would never accept such things unless they were completely fresh. It was the trouble with food of that kind that no one ever wanted at all, and it then became useless. Nor was the household made of money. Phineas not only lacked prospects, he lacked a suitable income also. Unhappily, Phineas was an intellectual without either creativity or judgment. Milly had realized it even during those early days in the Camargue, when Rodney and Angus were being conceived. In the kitchen, she was shaking so much she gashed the index finger of her left hand. It would, of course, have mattered more if she had been left-hand, as were Phineas and the boys, but it was a nasty enough cut, which bled far too much, so that fair-sized gouts fell on the newly prepared vegetable matter, which thereupon had to be slowly picked over a further time. Blood oozed through Milly's handkerchief and spotted the dress she had specially put on. At the same time, the big fry-up for the boys was beginning to run out of fat. In the end, they came charging in. Milly was weeping, of course, and in more and more of a muddle. Once, she had never muddled things, but quite the contrary. Perhaps that was why she wept now. For God's sake, Mum. We're hungry. We told you. Hungry as hunters. What had that originally meant? A kind of horse? A kind of tiger? A kind of man? What is it, Mum? What are we getting? Chops and liver and bacon and things, replied Milly in a very low voice, possibly inaudible above the sizzle. I've hurt my finger. We could eat the entire animal, said Angus. Phineas always lay on his bed while a major meal was in preparation, and Milly had to ascend and summon him, because the boys simply did not do it, however often she asked them. For days later, Milly's finger was as bad as ever and her left hand almost unusable. She knew that incurable illness often first manifested itself through minor injuries which failed to clear up. Oh, Mum, do get better, admonished Angus at breakfast when she let slip the teapot. It's entirely a matter of eating the right things, observed Phineas mildly, though, naturally, it'll take some months before you can expect to enjoy the benefits. Phineas himself was eating a small quantity of muesli and skim milk. He always used a tiny teaspoon for such purposes. The flap of the front door letterbox was heard, presage everywhere of Karen's final shoulder tap, bone against bone. The boys made a dash, as they did each day, but this time Milly had reached the door of the room before them. She stood there facing them. We're going for the post, Mum. I'm going for it this morning. You both sit down, please. It may be our reports, Mum. I'm going this morning, Angus. They were only a foot or two away, but before they could lay hands on her, she had not merely whipped open the door but also snatched the key out of the lock, flashed from the room, and managed to lock the door on the other side, all this with the real use of one hand only. For the moment she had proved as effective as she used to be, but there had been something strange about the incident, which had all begun with a vivid dream she had had the previous night, so vivid that she remembered it, or imagined it, still, and in detail. A small dream really, but prophetic. For the moment Phineas had been left to manage the two roaring boys. The French window was in the drawing room, but soon the boys would be out through the dining room casements and making mischief of some kind. Happily, the big drawing room window was never opened until after breakfast. The boys had never as yet intentionally smashed their way in or out, but Milly dreaded to see their huge faces gazing at her, diminishing her, from the world outside. Nonetheless, Milly paused for a moment, and quite consciously. Much was at stake if her dream could be taken at all seriously. It could. Milly had advanced into the hall, and the delivery had proved to consist of 2 accounts rendered and a packet with the school crest upon the envelope. Milly went back into the drawing room and, sitting down, even straightened the crease in her jeans. Then, while in the locked room the abominable hubbub raged on, she calmly opened the boys' reports. Reports they had been in her dream, and dire ones, At once a burden, but also, in certain ways, a release or a faint hope of release. The actual packet proved, however, simply to contain a letter, together with some appeal forms for reconditioning the school chapel. The letter, addressed to Phineas, was from the deputy headmaster. Millie read it. Dear Mr. Mork, I know you will forgive my writing on behalf of the headmaster, who has unfortunately been in hospital since the middle of the spring term, as you may possibly have heard from your sons. I very much regret to tell you that the trustees, to whom the matter has been referred in the absence of the headmaster, take the view that no useful purpose would be served by the return of your sons to the school at the commencement of the term now ahead. That is to say, the autumn term. It is the view of the trustees, in which I am bound to say I fully concur, that the boys are too physically mature to benefit from the ordinary course of tuition in class, however excellent. Perhaps they may be regarded as outside and beyond the normal school disciplines. In the circumstances, there would seem no advantage to our delivering the usual reports upon the conduct of the boys during the summer term, just past. Doubtless you will have drawn your own conclusions from the reports relating to previous terms, and will scarcely be surprised by the decision which the trustees have reached. It is the custom of the school to extend best wishes to all its old boys when finally they move towards new fields of endeavor, and I am sure that the headmaster, with whom, as I understand, you are on terms of long-standing and personal friendship, would wish me to make no exception in the present cases. May I venture to remind you of the outstanding account in respect of the boys' attendance during the summer term, and including a number of important extras? The bursar requests me to take this opportunity of remarking that he would be most grateful for a settlement during the next 7 days, as he is keeping his books open for this single item, and is being pressed by the school's honorary accountants. I am sure you will understand. Yours sincerely, Philip de Soto. Millie rose, unlocked the door, and re-entered the dining room, holding the letter high above her head. There are no reports, Phineas. They've been expelled. When the boys had been much younger, it might have availed to hold the letter up there, but now it was pointless, because they were far taller than she was, as well as in every way more brawny. The letter was out of her hands in a flash. It was very unlikely that they could understand it, and doubtful if they could even read all of it, but she herself had provided the clue, and at least they could take in the signature. It's the sod, cried Angus. The sod wrote it. Give it here, commanded Rodney. Within seconds the floor was littered with tiny scraps of paper, and the boys were standing shoulder to shoulder against the world, completely obscuring the framed photograph of their mother on a horse. What are you going to do now, Phineas? Inquired Millie. Phineas was, as always, making a point of being undisturbed. He continued to chase the last particles of saturated muesli with his toy teaspoon. Well, inquired Millie. Our sons have been expelled from their school. You'll have to do something with them. Was the term expulsion actually employed in the letter? Of course not. Schoolmasters don't use it nowadays. They're afraid of libel actions. Well then, we mustn't exaggerate. It's not at all uncommon for a headmaster to reach the view that a boy would fare better in some other school. Nowadays, there's no question of a stigma at all. The change in itself is often entirely beneficial. He drew a crisp bread from the packet, broke it in half, returned one half to the packet, and began to break up the other into reasonably symmetrical pieces on his plate. Each of the boys now had his arm round the other's shoulder, in the style of Tweedledum and Tweedledee. But they had no other resemblance to Tweedledum and Tweedledee. If you don't do something, Uncle Stephen will, said Millie. The boys extended their thick red tongues at her, but Phineas's eye was glancing at the Guardian, which lay on the table for him alone to read and take to work. Millie went upstairs, locked the door of the bedroom, and began looking through her old address book. It had little to offer, apart from varying shades and intensities of nostalgia and regret. She lay down on her unmade bed, turning her back on Phineas's unmade bed. She could not think while the boys were in the house, or, for different reasons, Phineas either. She could hear birds singing, and, from the next house, screeching music for early housewives. She knew that they were supposed to choose the records for themselves. Then, duly, there was a din of the boys leaving. At the moment their craze was to do something with dogs in the local wood, any dogs, as she understood it. She had no idea what it was that they did, nor did she wish to know. The wood was of course deserted on a weekday morning, apart from the usual misfits straying about and unlikely to present much of a problem to boys such as Rodney and Angus. Millie gave it a little longer, lest she walk into Phineas, then she unlocked the door and went down. Phineas had departed for work, with all the others. She had feared that the letter from Mr. De Soto might have held him back. She began to collect the torn pieces into a small plastic bag that was lying about, because she proposed to keep them. It was a surprisingly long job. She could not but remember that the mills of God tear exceeding small. Then she began to clear up and, later, to wash up. She could count on a little tranquility until the boys returned, raging for their midday meal. But the bell rang, and then there was that same flop from the letterbox, somewhat less menacing, however, when it is presumably a matter not of a postal delivery, but more probably of a harmless circular. Millie went out quite calmly. Duly, it was a publicity leaflet, a throwaway. Your fortune is in your hands, consult Thelma Model. Now. Modern palmistry absolutely private and confidential, normally no need for an appointment, nothing spooky, nothing embarrassing. 4. The parade. There is no reason why the human hand should not provide as good a guide to individual destiny as any other. The concluding quotation was unascribed. Millie fancied that it came from Aldous Huxley. She seemed to remember encountering something of the kind when trying to read one of Huxley's works at Oxford. The leaflet was inexpensively produced in simple black on simple white. It was quite small. Millie had almost finished her immediate chores. There was little incentive to embellish the tasks. She stuffed the bag of torn-up paper into her handbag because she could think of nothing else to do with it at the moment and set forth for 4, the parade. Reason and careful thought had proved alarmingly unfruitful. The moment had come to give the subliminal a trial, if that was the applicable word. An omen was an omen, and there were few of them. Number 4, the parade was her own fish shop, selling rough vegetables and packet cheese as well. She had never previously had occasion to heed the number. Upstairs had lived the rheumatism lady, who went round all the old folk in her little car. Millie was aware that lately the rheumatism lady had moved to a proper clinic, paid for by the ratepayers, because everyone was talking about it. Now at the foot of the stairs there was an arrow, with a curious curve in it pointing upwards, and the name Thelma Model newly painted at the heart of it in gray. Plain Thelma would, perhaps, have been too much like an unregulated fairground, and changing times were rendering the title, Madam, obsolete even in such cases as this. There was nothing to do but ascend. Thelma Model came out onto the little landing. Her jeans were pale green, and she wore a sleeveless gray jumper which looked as if it were woven from used raffia. As promised, there was to be no attempt at formality or mystification. Thelma Model had a smooth dark brown mop, falling over one side of her angular, sallow face and the enormous, rather empty eyes of the seer or pythoness. Indeed, at first she stared at Millie for a perceptibly long time without uttering a word. "Well, come in," she said at last, as if there had been some demur. They were in the rheumatism lady's small sitting room, though already it looked much more run down. The rheumatism lady's little watercolors had been replaced by wall cards bearing emblems of the zodiac, somewhat stained, and by no means a complete set. There was a round black table in the center of things, with 2 black composition chairs opposite one another. "Sit down," said Thelma Model, still a little petulantly, "and call me Thelma." Millie sat, as one does at such times, but Thelma continued to stand. She was observing Millie. "Would you prefer to smoke?" "I've given it up. My husband made me stop it." "Then why are you carrying a packet of Players in your handbag?" Millie felt that she had turned pale and puce at the same time. "It's an unopened packet." "I suppose you can see that too." "One thing I can't see is why you're here." "What are you looking for?" "Your leaflet came through my door. Just this moment, in fact. So will you please read my palm, or whatever it is you do?" Millie extended her hand across the table. "That's the wrong one," said Thelma. "But never mind. It would be no good with you in any case. I'll see what the cards have to say." She picked up a working pack from the mantel behind her. Millie would have supposed there would be shuffling, perhaps cutting, certainly a careful and symmetrical laying out. But all Thelma did was chuck 6 or 7 apparently random cards across the surface of the table. "You're in trouble right enough," said Thelma. "What sort of trouble?" asked Millie steadily. "You'll know the details best." "What's going to happen about it?" "It's going to get worse." "Yes, I suppose it's bound to do that." "I should try running away if I were you. Hide. Change your name. Change your appearance. Change everything. Join the raggle-taggle gypsies, in fact. After all, one must at times seek some proportion in things." "Please," exclaimed Thelma. "I am a gypsy." "I'm so sorry. But that was wrong too. I wasn't meaning to be rude. The gypsies wouldn't have you." "Why ever not?" But Millie was by now hardly surprised, hardly capable of surprise. "You're marked." "In what way?" "How am I marked?" "You don't mean that lacrosse accident." "No, not that." Millie reflected silently for a moment. If Thelma Modell would sit down, as consultants normally do, it could be that much easier. Millie spoke again. "Please tell me more." "The cards won't go any further." "Well, something else then." After all, there was a crystal on the mantel too, though Millie had never seen one in her life before. It was smaller than she had supposed, and some sort of large, shapeless thing leaning against the wall. "If you want to know more, it will have to be sex." Millie had heard at Oxford of sex magic and its alleged dangers. "I don't think I want that," she said. "That's quite all right," said Thelma rather nastily. "I shouldn't advise you to find out more anyway." "Why ever not? Is it really as terrible as all that?" "It might make you mad." The familiar Shakespearean phrase was really too much. Millie rose to her feet. "How much do I owe you?" Thelma's expression had become very odd. "No money. Just look in again. While you still have time of your own." "You've made a mistake there," said Millie. "The boys aren't going back. They've been expelled." "I've never claimed to be right every time." Millie managed to smile a little. "Please take some money. I have profited by your frankness." "Not from you," said Thelma. "I've told you what you can do." "I'll think about it," said Millie. "You can come and live here if you've nowhere else to go." "I can go to my Uncle Stephen." "Actually, he's pressing me." "You can do whatever you like," said Thelma. There was a scuffing up the stairs, and another client appeared. It was Dawn Mulcaster, mature, frustrated, and twittery as ever. She and Millie exchanged very faint smiles, but no words. Millie sped downwards. The curious thing was that, though nothing could have been more depressing and foreboding than Thelma's insights, yet Millie felt noticeably more buoyant than on her outward journey. As in the matter she had last night dreamed of, the burden was at the same time a release, or a faint hope of release. She was even able to muse smilingly upon a fortune-teller's obvious need of a receptionist, and upon the positively comical discrepancy between this particular fortune-teller's publicity and her performance. Perhaps the discrepancy was mainly in tone. All the same, surely the interview had been spooky in the extreme? Dawn Mulcaster would certainly be finding it so. Millie felt that she had done better than Dawn was likely to be doing. In fairness to Thelma Modell's publicity person, Millie had to acknowledge that she did not feel in the least embarrassed. She stopped in the street for a moment. A more precise thought had struck her. Her cut finger was completely healed. Somehow she had even parted with the unpleasant bandage. She smiled and continued homewards. The boys stormed back, wolfed their food without a word to Millie, and stormed out again. Millie washed up after the three of them, circulated round the parade and the avenue, shopping, meditating, put together 2 totally different evening meals, and then went upstairs to lie on her bed, in order to prepare for another confrontation with Phineas. She must keep up the pressure or go mad, as Thelma Modell had predicted. Indeed, when Millie fell asleep, she found she was dreaming of Thelma's establishment, where she, Millie, now appeared to have a job of some kind, as she was seated at the toilet table in what had been the rheumatism lady's bathroom, and sorting through hundreds, perhaps thousands, of invoices in the desperate hope of finding her own. The invoices were on paper of different sizes and textures, and in many different handwritings, mostly illegible. Millie was amazed by the mental processes that must lie behind the ways in which many of the bills were laid out. Only those which had been drafted by Uncle Stephen were fully orderly. When Millie awoke, it occurred to her to wonder whether Thelma herself could write at all, or whether she relied mainly on bluff, as did Rodney and Angus, though no one ever dared to mention it. There was the noise of creeping about downstairs. Then Phineas's voice floated up the stairwell. "Millie." She shriveled. "Millie, where are you?" It was far, far too early for his return. Could he have lost his job? That might be yet another burden, which was not a burden entirely, but very faintly a forerunner. Millie threw off the eiderdown, pulled on a jacket, and sauntered downstairs. Phineas was positively prancing from room to room. It was impossible that he could have been promoted because, in his position, there was no real promotion. His step seemed light and gay, as with the man in the ballad. "I've been adopted," cried Phineas, unable to contain himself until she had reached the ground floor, terra firma. "Whatever for?" "As Liberal candidate, of course." "At North Zero." "Where's that?" "It's in Cornwall, and Andrew McAndrew says I should have every chance." She had been perfectly well aware that Phineas was frequenting the local Liberal Association and bringing their literature home. It was one of various activities of his that resulted in her being so often alone with the boys. "Does the party find the money for your deposit, or do you have to do it?" "I haven't the slightest idea. I haven't thought about it. Perhaps the boys can go down and canvass for you? They're too young, as you can perfectly well imagine for yourself. I'm afraid I shall have to sacrifice much of my family life and leave the boys more in the hands of their mother." "I notice that you haven't congratulated me, Millie." "If it's what you want, I'm pleased for you, Phineas. Provided, that is, that you find a new school for the boys before you set out." "I haven't been able to think much about that, as you can imagine. I feel it is something their mother can perfectly well do for them if the necessity should arise." "I can and shall do nothing of the kind, Phineas. Finding a school for boys like that is the father's job." "I mean it, Phineas." She was almost glowing with resolution. She realized that to display moral qualities demands practice, just as much as intellectual and manual qualities. She had never really attended when, down the years, such truths had been hammered into her. But she also knew that much of her relied upon the boys being out of the house. "I had hoped you might be pleased for me," said Phineas, entering the sitting room and draping himself. "Could I have my lactose, please?" "It's too early. It's only just past tea time." Phineas eschewed tea because of the tannin, which affected both his colon and his autonomic structure. "I'm going to get myself a cup of tea," said Millie. "And then I want to go on talking seriously." In her heart, she was not in the least surprised to find, when she returned, that Phineas had taken himself off. Perhaps he had gone out to look for the boys. He liked to delude himself that he could join in their play, though Millie knew better, knew that he was accepted on the very thinnest of sufferance, for short periods only, and only for ulterior reasons. In the boys' eyes, there was very little to choose between Phineas's status and hers. She knew that, even if he did not. Millie took her little tray upstairs, locked the bedroom door, took off her jacket once more, and wriggled beneath the eiderdown. She had brought up the family-size packet of Playmate biscuits, really meant for the boys. But, contrary to expectation, Phineas drifted back in no time. Elation at the thought of the new and more fulfilling life that lay before him had probably made him restless. Soon, he was tapping at their bedroom door. "Let me in, please. I'm having a rest. I'll come out when it's time for your supper." "Where are the boys?" "In the wood with the dogs, as far as I know. It might be better if they were encouraged to stay more in their own home." "That's their father's job." "Millie, what are you doing in there?" "I'm lying down, and now I'm going back to sleep." She knew that by now there was not a hope of it, though she had spoken as positively as she could. So positively, indeed, that there was quite a pause. Then Phineas said, "I might as well have my lactose now. I've had a lot to think about today." Grumpily, Millie emerged. Rest and peace had gone, as well as slumber. "Let me carry the tray," said Phineas. "It's right that I should do these things when I'm here." He was not at all used to the work, and had to descend the stairs very slowly, like a stick insect. "What is going to happen to your job?" asked Millie, as soon as the tray was on the sinks around, more or less in safety. "That must come second. In life, one has to make such decisions. Meanwhile, what pays the boys' school fees? They won't have them at the ordinary local school. You know that. I shall have my parliamentary salary in the end, and shall of course make you an allowance for things of that kind." "Could I please have my lactose?" So you propose quite calmly to live entirely on me, on my little income from Daddy's estate? Not if you do not wish it. You and the boys can do that, if necessary, and lucky we are that it should be so. I myself can apply for a maintenance grant. Do you mean the dole? Of course not. I refer to the Applecroft Fund for supporting liberal candidates. I did not intend to approach them, but I always can if you lack all interest in your husband's career in life. Phineas. Millie tried to sound positively menacing. I tell you again that I accept no responsibility for the future of the boys, financial or otherwise. They are out of my hands. Well, Millie, in the very, very last resort, that's a matter for the common law, is it not? But there is no need at all for it to come to that. It would be bad for your chances if it did. Not nowadays. Your notion of the world often seems antediluvian, Millie dear. The boys neither love nor want me. Not that they love or want you either. Quite unselfconsciously, Phineas smiled. What boys feel for their father is something a woman cannot understand, not even their mother. It's something that really is antediluvian, Millie. If you had any understanding whatever of what goes on around you, you'd know better than to talk such rubbish. No one is more concerned than I am about what goes on everywhere in the world. His eyes were filled with a need for his mission to be understood and appreciated, for the lactose that by now really was due. Millie set about preparing it. Where are the boys? Asked Phineas, as the sun sank in unnoticed glory. I expect they're at the lavender bag, as they were last night. Millie looked at her watch, the boys having stopped the clock so often that it no longer seemed to her worth paying for repairs. No, the lavender bag will have shut some time ago. Perhaps it's some kind of special evening? They would have come here and gorged themselves and then gone back. Well, what are we to think, Millie? It really might be better if you took more interest in what your sons do. I shan't be able to give so much time to it in the future. You must understand that. Millie went to the record player and put on Honegger's Pacific 231. The next piece on the record was Masilov's Factory Music. Before the record could reach Gravini's homage to Marinetti, Millie turned the machine off. Would you like your supper? I should like mine. I shall have to take more care over what I eat now that I have so much greater responsibility. But when, shortly afterwards, the moment came, he seemed to pick and niggle very much as usual. Her own appetite was undoubtedly the more disturbed of the two. In the end, the police arrived, though not until it was quite dark. Most unusually, it was Phineas who unwound himself and let the man in. For this reason, Millie did not learn his rank, lacked the opportunity to glance at his official card. The man was not in his blues, but dressed overall by a multiple outfitter. Good evening, madam. Do either of you know anything of two men named Angus Mork and Rodney Mork? They've given this address. There are two sons, officer, said Phineas. Indeed, sir? I should hardly have thought it. Certainly not in your case, madam. These two are fully grown men. In fact, rather more than that. Don't be ridiculous, officer, said Phineas. They are our sons, and we know exactly how big they are. I wonder if you altogether do, sir. If you don't mind my saying so, madam. It took a whole squad to get them under any kind of control. And even then, there are some very nasty injuries which the court will be hearing about tomorrow, in addition to the other charges. The sergeant is worried about whether the cells will hold them. The station isn't Parkhurst Prison. It's only intended for quiet overnight cases. But I mustn't do all the talking. I've only come to make the usual routine inquiries. The two men, boys, if you prefer, madam, do really reside here, then? Of course they do, said Phineas. This is their home. If you say so, sir. Now, how old would each of them be? They're twins. Surely you must have realized that? As far as I recall, they are rising 16. You mean that they're 15, sir? Yes, I think that's right. 15. It's incredible, if you don't mind my saying so, madam. In the course of your work, said Phineas, you must have realized that some boys grow faster than some other boys. It was high time for Millie to speak. What have the two of them done? What are they alleged to have done? Phineas corrected. If anything, of course. The officer made it clear that from now on, and whatever the rule book might say, he preferred to deal with Millie. I'm afraid the charges are rather serious, madam. In fact, we've never before had anything to compare with it since the station first opened, which of course was when most of the houses like this one were being built. We haven't had much violence in the suburb, serious violence that is, though of course it's growing fast pretty well everywhere in the world. What have they done, officer? Please tell me. I'm perfectly able to face it. Again, the additional burden that could at the same time be a further remote prospect of freedom. Remember, put in Phineas, that it's still only mere allegation. It is well known that the police exaggerate, sometimes very greatly. I speak as an adopted parliamentary candidate. Do you indeed, sir? For somewhere around here, that is. No, not locally. But it makes no difference. Well, madam, said the officer, with professional quietness, as for the charges, they include a long list of assaults, 15 at least so far, and we are expecting more. Some of those we already have are very serious indeed. Not what we're used to around here, as I have remarked. More like the Glasgow docks in the old days, I should have said. Then there's a lot of damage to property. A lot of damage to a lot of property, I should have put it. Doors stove in and roofs ripped about and ornaments smashed. There are a couple of attempted rapes expected to be reported soon, from what the other officers say. A couple at least. In these times, there's no such thing as attempted rape, objected Phineas. It's a rape or it isn't a rape, and most people are very doubtful about it even if it's supposed to be proved. And that's not to mention the injuries inflicted on the officers, which we don't like at all, madam, especially in a quiet district like this. No, said Millie soberly, I'm sure not. Now, if I could have a few details of the education these lads have had? Supposing them to have had any, of course. But it's no matter for joking, all the same. It's an offense, too, not to educate a child. Millie realized that the night air was coming in through the front door, which Phineas had left open. The night air of a hot summer. Phineas made no move, and Millie did not care to leave him just then even for a single moment. Besides, closing the outer door might lead to new suspicions. By the end of it, and indeed long before that, Millie knew perfectly well that Phineas should have produced the whiskey, but that, thanks to Phineas, there was no whiskey in the house. Most assuredly, she could not be absent long enough to make tea, even supposing the officer to be interested in tea at that hour. If the accused really are what the law calls minors, said the officer, then a parent will be required to attend the court. Of course my husband will attend the court, said Millie. Perhaps you too, madam? A mother can often influence the justices more than a father. Millie smiled. I shall remember that, officer. Not that a case of this kind is likely to remain with petty sessions for long. It will be simply a matter of a quick committal, as far as I can see. I'm sure you are once more greatly exaggerating, officer, said Phineas, smiling in his turn. You'll be there to hear for yourself, sir, replied the officer, entirely reasonable. When he had gone, Millie found it almost impossible even to speak to Phineas. I'm not sharing a room with you, she managed to say. Please yourself, said Phineas. After today's news, I've still a great deal to think about and plan, as anyone but you would see at once. Next morning, and really quite early next morning, the childless Hubert Ellsworth was the first with the local news, or with a bit of it. In his old yachting jumper, with part of the club name still on it, and shapeless gray bags splashed with oil from his garden workshop, he stood there trying to arrange his scattered locks. I thought I ought to tell you first, Phineas, as, after all, we are neighbors. I've heard that there are 2 sex maniacs on the loose. Apparently, the authorities feel we should warn one another to keep everything bolted and barred. What times we live in? Phineas. Millie, who had overheard this in her nightdress, could already see, from the bathroom window, Morwenna Ellsworthy's ceiling every aperture with passepartout, despite the season, and even pulling down blinds. The next arrival was young Graham, the local weekly's cub reporter, as people described him, and the only one who left the office very often. Girls tended to tell him that they liked the name Graham. That time, Millie opened the door. May I come in for a few moments, Mrs. Mork? It's really rather important. Millie had never before spoken to him, though, like everyone else, she knew who he was. He was a nice young lad, everyone said. In any case, He was by now sufficiently practiced in his profession never to take even the hint of a negation as an answer. "Well, what is it?" asked Millie. "Do sit down." Phineas, having dealt with Hubert Ellsworthy, had gone back to bed. In the marital bedroom, Millie had spent the night on the lounge sofa convertible which, at the time of hire purchase, she had, consciously or subconsciously, made sure really was long enough and wide enough to live up to its brochure. "You've heard the news, Mrs. Mork?" "What news in particular?" "The police station in the approach has been completely wrecked." "I've never seen anything like it," said young Graham very seriously. "Well, what can I do? Would you like a cup of coffee?" "Not just at the moment, Mrs. Mork, though thanks all the same. The thing is that the station inspector tipped us the wink that your two boys were being held for all that damage last night. And now, presumably, they've made a getaway. Would you care to give me a statement?" "No," said Millie. "Are the boys here, Mrs. Mork? After all, it's their home." "I have nothing to say," said Millie, hoping she had the formula right. "Then, presumably, they are here? Don't worry, I shan't give them away." "Nor do you have to give them away. You can just say whatever comes into your head. It doesn't much matter what it is, really." Millie could see that he was only trying to be kind. "Nothing. So would you please go? I'm sorry to turn you out, but I'm sure you'll understand. Rum tykes, aren't they? Sorry, I suppose that's not a very nice way of talking to their mother. My kid brother told me about the month or whatever it was they spent in the under-7. They made a mark there all right, from what Matheson had to say. Marked everyone, in fact. Do please give me a statement of some kind, Mrs. Mork. Anything you like. Just anything." "I'm sorry," said Millie. "I really am. I know you're only doing your job. Well, I suppose there's not much more I can do this time, but you're famous now, Mrs. Mork, and there'll be others coming fast in my footsteps. Not that I've missed a scoop. Not personally, that is. I don't suggest that." "I'm glad," said Millie, meeting his generosity at least halfway. "And I'm sorry you're in trouble, Mrs. Mork. I really am. You're still a very nice-looking girl, if I may put it that way." "I don't see why you shouldn't," said Millie. "Well, that's it, wouldn't you say?" Millie opened her handbag and carefully combed her hair. She went upstairs. Phineas lay there, reading minutes. "Phineas, I'm leaving you." "Oh, please calm down and let's have breakfast." "Get it yourself. I'm packing and going. I'll collect the rest of my things as soon as I can. The things that are left. Before the boys smash them too." "Millie," cried Phineas, while she bustled around with a quiet efficiency she had not known for years. "Millie, don't you realize that this is the moment in all their lives when our sons are likely to need their mother most? Surely you must see that for yourself? The moment in their lives when I need you most too." "I've done all I can," said Millie. "You're full of educational theories. Now's the time for you to give them a real trial. You, not me. At least come with me to the court? Let's have breakfast quietly and consider what line to take. I'm sure the whole thing is quite grossly exaggerated. The police do that, you know. I keep saying so. It would be quite difficult to exaggerate in any way about the boys. But you're their mother, Millie. Perhaps that's how I know. You learn nothing." Replete and bursting though it was, she shut her suitcase with new strength. It still bore her maiden name, Melanie Piggott. Why should she not return to that, when in due course she had left Uncle Stephen's abode and started a life of her own? The green suitcase had been a joint present from her parents on her 21st birthday. At the time, she had wondered how long the family name would still be hers, but now it might be hers once more, and for a very indefinite period. When empty, the suitcase was delightfully weightless. When full, delightfully substantial. "I'm not going to bother with goodbye," said Millie. Phineas clutched at her physically. His overlong arm was as the tentacle of an undernourished octopus. "Millie, do at least try to be sensible. Just get breakfast, and we'll talk it all over as much as you like." She threw his elongated hand back on the bedspread. As she bore her packed suitcase briskly up the drive, she reflected that 2 days ago she could hardly have lifted the thing from the bedroom floor. She wondered how long it would be before the inevitable reaction and collapse. Uncle Stephen saw to it that Millie wanted for nothing. Every morning he brought her the loveliest, most fragrant breakfast in bed. Every evening he lingered in her room, tucking her in, adjusting the ventilation and positioning of the curtains, putting away any clothes she had left about, gossiping about the small events of the day, taking away her shoes in order to give them a rub. He prepared most of the other meals too. As he pointed out, he would have had to feed himself in any case, and having to feed her too made the whole thing into a work of joy. He had many outside engagements: bridge, bowls, the rifle and revolver ranges, the committee of the small amateur soccer club, the British Legion, the Skeleton ARP, the Patriotic Alliance, which was often in a state of inner schism, and therefore particularly demanding. But Millie could never for one moment doubt that she constituted the primary demand both upon his heart and even upon his time. The undiagnosed trouble inside Millie had ceased even to demand diagnosis. "You do spoil me, Uncle Stephen." "It's lovely." She lay on the settee in lounging pajamas and matching surtout, as the manufacturers termed it. She had never been able to bother with garments of that kind before, but now Uncle Stephen had bought them for her at Kadia's in the new vanity market, and she had helped to choose them too. She had rather looked down on such shops and on such clothes, but that had been ignorance and the wrong kind of sophistication. It was almost impossible to believe that Phineas lived only 11.5 miles away as the crow flew, if any crow should be so misdirected. "I like being spoilt, Uncle Stephen," said Millie. "I love to do it, girl. You're all I have, you know that, and always have been." That must have been what Phineas would have called an exaggeration, but it was true that Uncle Stephen, so far as was known, had at all times looked after himself. Now he had a thick mop of silky white hair, like a wise old lion, and the same green eyes as his sister, Millie's mother, and as Millie herself. "All the same, I can't stay forever," said Millie coyly. "Why on earth not? First, I'll look after you, and do it with love in my heart. Then, when I'm past it, you'll look after me, well, some of the time. In the end, I'll leave you all I've got. I've no one else. Remember that. It's not much, but it will be enough." "I'll remember, Uncle Stephen, and thank you." All the same, a woman nowadays is expected to lead a life of her own. I was all set to do it. You've tried that sort of thing once, girl, and you've seen what happened. Uncle Stephen's I wandered away from her, which was unusual. I wish I could put a hand to one of the rattans I used to have. "What are they, Uncle Stephen?" asked Millie, though really she knew fairly well. "Disciplinary instruments, my love." Disciplinary instruments. Never had one out of my right hand during all the years I was in the archipelago. I wonder if anything's happened by now? Millie spoke a little drowsily. The wine at dinner had been South African, and she had fallen badly out of practice. "You let sleeping dogs lie. Never trouble until trouble troubles you." She smiled at him. It would be absurd to argue about anything. "Carry me to bed, Uncle Stephen." She dreamt that she and Thelma Modell were climbing Everest together. They were both garbed in the latest chic, waterproof, windproof, cold-proof clothing, and carried little axes, silvery in the sun. Thelma, the gypsy, was deputizing as a Sherpa. It was all exceedingly enjoyable, and not at all too steep for Millie's new energies. The summit lay straight ahead. They might have tea when they arrived there, or Thelma might have to have ideas of her own about a suitable gypsy celebration. How many months later was it when Millie opened the Daily Telegraph and saw the familiar headline, "Liberal loses deposit"? Apparently the sitting member for North Zero had fallen over a cliff, or at least been discovered by children dashed to pieces on the rocks below. The coroner had returned an open verdict, and a by-election had followed. Previously Millie's eyes must have glided over these events. Uncle Stephen brought her the Daily Telegraph or the Sunday Telegraph with her early morning tea, and the Imperialist every time there was a new issue. That day, when a little later he came up with her breakfast, too small, heavenly-smelling kippers and the perfect toast upon which she could always rely, she was pensive. "Uncle Stephen, tell me, did they ever catch those boys? I suspect you know all the time." "I know nothing that you don't know, little girl." She eyed him. "What exactly does that mean? Do you know the answer to the question I asked?" She spoke quite roguishly. "I do not. I know what my answer would be if I only had the chance. Now eat your scrap of porridge or it'll go cold. I'll sugar it for you." Millie dragged herself upwards. She really preferred to eat in a sprawling position, but Uncle Stephen liked to see more of her. Tell me, Uncle Stephen, have there been any more happenings? Like the one on the night before I left. I simply don't read the reports of things like that. That's the self-protective instinct, my little love, and you could do with more of it, not less. But have there, Uncle Stephen? I'd rather like to know. Nothing that anyone could get a grip on. Or nothing that's come my way. I don't spend all day reading the newspapers. It can get hold of you as poisonously as the television if you once let it. You're hiding something, Uncle Stephen. That I am not. There are these violences all over the world every minute of the day. Everyone's a villain without proper discipline. I haven't noticed the names of your two lads in particular. And you haven't heard anything locally either? Not a word. I'd be out in no time if I had, after what's been done. The last words very nearly convinced Millie. Let me pour your chocolate, said Uncle Stephen. But immediately he spoiled it all by speaking further. They'll have shot up a lot further by this time, he observed. His eyes were searching round the room, as they always did when the subject of the boys arose. Thank you, Uncle Stephen, said Millie as he stopped pouring. It's a beautiful breakfast. When I've finished it, I'd like to sleep a little more. Then I'll come down and give you a hand. He took the hint quite quietly. He merely said, I see now that you're looking pale. Don't you worry about helping me. I can easily bring up your little lunch when the time comes. You are good to me, Uncle Stephen. But as soon as he had left the room and closed the door, Millie began to heave, and in no time, while trying to muffle the noise, she was being copiously sick into the article provided in well-found houses for that and other purposes, as sick as she had been, without cessation as it had seemed, during the long months before the two boys were born. Really, there could be no question of Millie even attempting to lead a life of her own as, like so many women, she had originally, in a vague way, intended. She was afraid to leave the house, and even more so after what Uncle Stephen had so casually said. That she had good reason to lie low was confirmed by the episodes that followed. It was more than a year after Millie had left Phineas, and the gold of summer was fast dissolving into the copper of autumn, when one night Millie stirred in her sleep to see a big face pressed against the panes of her first-floor bedroom window. Whether it was Angus's face or Rodney's face, which of their faces, she would probably not by now have known in any case. It was an unseemly blot on the October moonlight, then it ducked. What was more, her window was open, as at night it always was. The boy was far too big to climb right in, but he could easily have inserted a huge arm, perhaps reached to the bed, and then strangled or humiliated her. Millie had realized from the first that the boys must have a perfectly clear idea of where she was, even though she emerged so seldom, and Uncle Stephen never recommended otherwise. What had decided the boys to re-enter her life now? She had seen only one of them, but was sure that the other was there also, because the other always was. She suspected that by now their combined strength could throw down the entire house. And very possibly they were growing still. Boys by no means always cease to grow at 16 or 17. She drew on her kimono and ran to Uncle Stephen's room. She knocked at his door, as she had done before when hungry during the night, or when merely lonely. Come in, girl. Come in. Uncle Stephen. The boys are back. One of them has just looked through my window in the moonlight. I think I'm going to be sick again. Come in with me, little love. I'll look after you and protect you. That's what I'm doing in your life. That's what I'm here for. You know that. Fortunately, it was a very large bed. Uncle Stephen had brought it back from the east, from gorgeous, sanctified Goa, now forever lost. When I was young, I could never in my life have even imagined anything so frightening, said Millie. Not until the boys were born. Or actually a little before that. When Phineas and I were on our honeymoon. In France, and then in the marshes behind Ariano. I never dared to read horror stories and ghost stories. She snuggled towards Uncle Stephen. No man and no woman knows anything of the troubles they are going to meet with in life. Or I take it they'd succeed in dodging them, said Uncle Stephen. They're supposed to be sent to form and mold us, but my idea is to form and mold them whenever possible. Remember that. You're the most wonderful uncle, Millie murmured, though she was still shivering and gulping. I'll stay with you 10 minutes while you calm down and arrange your pinafore, and then I'm going hunting. No, Uncle Stephen. It's too dangerous. They're watching the house. They're immense. Many times in my life I've been under siege. Each time, in the end, I burst out and destroyed everything in sight. I'm hard to hold, Millie. Things have changed since those days, Uncle Stephen. It's sad, but it's true. Even the imperialist admits it. That was the bit I read you when you ordered me to stop. There's nothing for either of us to do nowadays but escape. A fortune teller told me that last year, and now it's come true. I know all about times changing, none better, said Uncle Stephen, holding her close. The fact remains that I have not changed. I am older, unfortunately, but otherwise exactly the same. Also, I have weapons, I have strategy and tactics, and I have experience. I am going to give those cubs the lesson they've needed since their first birthday. I learned, my little love, to deal with growing boys in a harder school than Eton and Harrow or any of those places. I'm not going to let you try. You're overconfident. Those two are like children of the future. She was appalled. Perhaps they are children of the future? I'll admit that they're too big for their boots, said Uncle Stephen drily. If you go anywhere near them, they'll harm you. We're just going to wait for the daylight. I'll stay with you if you'll let me. Then we'll steal away somewhere for a bit. Somewhere nice. You've always said you could afford it if only circumstances had been different. Well, circumstances are different, whether we like it or not. We could go and stay in an hotel at Southampton, and you could look at the different ships going to places. You would like that, wouldn't you? And if everyone behaved in that way, inquired Uncle Stephen. If everyone did, what would become of our country? Things are rough enough already. You're as bad as that so-called man of yours, Millie. But he spoke affectionately, nonetheless, cuddling and caressing her, not meaning his comparison very seriously. Uncle Stephen, don't be silly. They're not ordinary boys you can either pamper or stand in the corner. They're enormous. I told you what the man from the police station said. They're quite beyond handling by any single individual. All I know is that they're boys, and that's enough. I don't want to leave you alone, as you know perfectly well, my little pet, but I'm going. You just lie in my bed until I'm back. And don't worry. I'm here to keep you from all harm. And I have weapons. Remember that. He squeezed her hand and clambered out into the night. Soon he was on the roof, directly above her. She could hear the slotting of iron into iron, or was it nowadays steel into steel? When she had lived beside the Heath as a small child during the Second World War, the ATS girls operating the anti-aircraft unit concealed among the evergreen gorse had made that noise all day as they took the long guns to pieces and put them together again. Uncle Stephen possessed artillery of his own. It was included in the weapons he had mentioned, nor did it consist in a couple of squat, serious-comic muzzle-loading peninsular war mortars, looking like pugs. On the contrary, Uncle Stephen could mount at least 3 quite modern-looking pieces, painted not black but dark green as gorse and palpably requiring expert knowledge to discharge satisfactorily, the kind of knowledge that the girls on the Heath had been acquiring during the daytime. He had explained to Millie that these guns were designed by the authorities primarily for withstanding a concerted rush. She wondered when he had managed to dismantle at least one of them in the room downstairs and reassemble it on the roof of the house without her hearing or noticing a thing. She might have been impressed by his foresight, but instead resurrected her suspicions that Uncle Stephen had all along known something that he had failed to pass on. There was a flash and a crash, quite startlingly like 6:30 or 7:30 p.m. when Millie had been but a tot. Another and another. Millie fully realized that this could not continue for long, not in the modern world. Somehow it would be stopped, however justified it might be, even by the narrowest legalistic standard of self-defense and of protecting an unarmed mother. Concurrently, Millie was subdued by a confused melee of feeling about Angus and Rodney, even though she had never been able within herself to accept that they were authentically her own offspring. A shadow passed between the moon and the casement. Surely the boys should have been intelligent enough to take cover? How, without doing so, had either of them survived Uncle Stephen's cannonade? Uncle Stephen was the least likely of men to aim and then miss. He kept in continual practice, as in so many directions. Another flash and crash. though this time in the latter was a curious rending sound, as if the gun barrel were about to burst asunder. Millie had heard of guns soldering up through being fired continuously day and night. Probably Uncle Stephen's gun had not of late been fired often enough to be in prime condition. Millie realized the danger that Uncle Stephen might be running from the gun exploding within itself and shattering into smithereens, as she understood that guns not infrequently did. But by now the official legions were massing. Millie could hear outer space blastings of fire engines, of ambulances, of police cars, and between them the insect whinings of television vans and radar. It was much as the moment when an escape from a concentration camp is first notified. She ran to the window. Functionaries were swarming over and around machines to make sure that nothing remained unaccounted for in the designated area, except criminally. It was an ideal spot for such an operation, as Uncle Stephen's house stood in comparative isolation at a corner of the woods, a public open space owned by the council. Millie ran back to her own room. It would be most unwise to turn on a light, and possibly the current had already been chopped at the main. In any case, public lights were beginning to range, brutal searchlights, and the torture chamber arc lights necessary for television. Millie tore off her nightdress. She plunged into her jeans and a thick sweater which Uncle Stephen had bought for her at the supply stores where he bought many of his own garments. She had lost her handkerchief and took out a clean one. For these simple actions the case was cogent enough. But Millie then hesitated. Uncle Stephen had stopped firing, and Millie could but speculate upon the exact reason. She could not possibly bring herself to desert Uncle Stephen, but the thing of which she was most certain was that the two of them could not win. She suspected that Uncle Stephen really knew that as well as she did. So what then? Cautiously, she re-entered Uncle Stephen's bedroom. The beam of light which now filled it illuminated nothing human or real. In her short absence, the room had been killed. Millie realized that Uncle Stephen was in difficulties. The gun was refusing to fire, as cars sometimes refuse to start. Uncle Stephen was tinkering with it, bashing it, cursing it. Soon, in the nature of things, the functionaries would close in finally, nor would it be a concerted attack of the kind which the gun was designed to ward off. It would be more a matter of irresistible infiltration, worked out long before in every detail, standard practice, precluding all possibility of topographical variation. Millie ascended the attic ladder to the roof tree. Uncle Stephen, she called down to him. Absorbed though he was in his mail task, he looked up at once. "Go back," he cried out. "Go back, little Millie." "What's up, Uncle Stephen? What's gone wrong?" Nothing else was possible than to enter into things as he saw them. "The boys have won this round, Millie. We must admit that. They've put the gun right out of action." "But how, Uncle Stephen?" "It's some kind of schoolboy muck. They dropped a whole gob of it into the breach. Clever monkeys, we must admit." Millie had almost forgotten the boys, incredible though that seemed. "Where are they now?" "I'll bet they've made off. They don't have much more to do, just at this moment." Millie glanced anxiously round amid the confused and inhuman lights. But she knew that for a second she had almost wished the boys had still been there, as some kind of reassurance against all that was developing. "I said I was here to protect you," affirmed Uncle Stephen, "and I shall do it still. I have always won the last battle. Always and always. Come away with me, Uncle Stephen, while there's time." He went through burlesque, bristling motions. "You don't suppose I shall knuckle down to a couple of schoolboys with their pockets full of gum?" He expressed it facetiously, but of course he meant it, could hardly have meant it more. Now that the firing had ceased for some time, the encircling host had begun to relax. Cups of tea were being consumed, ambulance workers were chatting to firemen on familiar subjects, their respective rates of pay and conditions of employment, their pension prospects, the maladies of their dear ones. "Oh, come on, Uncle Stephen. If the boys have gone, we can go too." To her consternation, he was not to be budged. "No, girl," he said. "This is my home, my castle, as we used to say, and perhaps by now it's your home and castle too. Wouldn't you say that's very nearly true, Millie?" He had given up fiddling with the gun and was addressing himself to something even more important. "The boys will return," she said, "when all the people have gone. And you'll be in endless trouble for firing that gun in any case, even though I know you did it for my sake." All my guns are licensed, Millie. I'm a registered holder of firearms. And as for the boys, let them come. I want nothing better. They've won a battle. They won't win the war. They're hulking brutes, but they're still only schoolboys. Look at this. Uncle Stephen displayed the mess on his hands and combat suit. We shan't feel the same about the house ever again, Uncle Stephen. You must know that. If we were all to let ideas of that kind govern our lives, we'd all be homeless. Uncle Stephen sat back on the semi-dismantled gun. You mustn't suppose, girl, that I don't know what you mean. It's simply that not one thing in life is ever gained by running away. This is our home, yours and mine, and here we stay. I'm afraid of the boys coming back, said Millie. I'm terrified. The big lights were being turned out, one after another. It is often noticeable that they are in use only for a few minutes. By now Millie was unsure whether she preferred the crude glare or the deep darkness. Someone was hammering at the front door. It was of course inevitable, sooner or later. Probably it had been going on at a lesser intensity for some time. Millie dropped down the attic ladder and flitted through the dark house like a noctambule. She was not going to wait for any nonsense from Uncle Stephen about taking no notice. All the same, at the foot of the stairs she stood and called out. After all, it might conceivably be the boys. Who's there? In the hall, the trophies were shaggy as a tropical forest. I'm a police officer, madam. Kindly open the door. She knew the voice. She slipped the chain and drew the big bolts in a trice. We're old friends, officer. All the same, he showed his card and said, Detective Sergeant Meadowsweet. Millie smiled. May we have some light on the scene, madam? Would that be safe? Safe as could be, madam. The two men have been sighted miles away, and we're closing in steadily. Oh, gasped Millie. So you know? Of course we know, madam. What else did you think we were doing here? Now, I just want you to tell me all that's taken place. After that, I must have a word with the gentleman upstairs who's been treating himself to a little pistol practice. I hope he's not done any damage. No particular damage that we know of, but that's more by luck than judgment, wouldn't you say? He's got all the necessary licenses. We know that, madam, but he happens not to have a license to fire at intruders, because no such license exists. Jobs of that kind must be left to the police. It sometimes causes hardship, but it's the law, and a gentleman with all those different licenses knows better than most what they permit him to do and what not. Perhaps I should say, put in Millie, that the gentleman's my uncle. He kindly took me in after the trouble we had a year ago. A little more than a year, actually. I could see at the time that your husband wasn't much help, said Detective Sergeant Meadowsweet in his inimitable way, and then duly added, if you don't mind my saying so, madam. Oh no, I don't mind, said Millie. Phineas was utterly wet from first to last. The whole thing was the biggest mistake I ever made. Not that mistake is quite a strong enough word. But do sit down, Sergeant. I take it, said the detective sergeant as he did so, that the two men were attempting to force an entrance? Tonight, I mean. They're really only boys, said Millie, absurd though it seems. I don't think we need to go over that ground again, madam. If you remember, we covered it fully when Mr. Mork was there. So the two of them were attempting to force an entrance. Well, not exactly, as I have to admit. What happened was simply that I saw one of them out on the lawn and rather lost my head. You know what they look like, Sergeant? How enormous they are. Yes, we know very well, madam. Don't you worry about that. The approved school couldn't hold them for a week. The Tower of London would be more the thing, I'd say. So what happened then? They're so strong too. I admit that I'm frightened to think about it. But of course you know about that too. The sergeant nodded. He had settled himself on a big black stool from somewhere in French West Africa. Millie had been given to understand that, before the French came, the potentate whose official seat it had been, perhaps even throne, had at times waded through blood almost to the knees. She had difficulty in remembering which of the different regions the different things came from, especially as Uncle Stephen had shifted in mid-career from the fairly far east to Africa, and then back to the east. The legs of the stool were decorated with small projecting bones and teeth, inserted into the woodwork. Above the detective sergeant's head flapped a faded rushwork curtain originally intended, Uncle Stephen had said, to deter the flesh-eating birds and bats from entering one's room during the night. So what happened then, madam? I admit that I completely lost my head and ran into my uncle, who took steps to defend me. No more than that. Another voice broke in. I take full responsibility, officer. Uncle Stephen had appeared at the top of the stairs. He had changed into his usual sharply pressed trousers and camel hair jacket. The situation was extremely menacing. I was protecting my own flesh and blood against a couple of thugs. Yes, sir, they're a nasty enough pair, according to all the evidence. The police are fed to the teeth with them, I can tell you that. Very good of you to confirm what I say, officer. I am sorry I had to take the law into my own hands, but you'll agree that I had every justification. I've spent most of my life in places where you have to think quickly the whole time, or you find yourself dead. Worse than dead. May I suggest that we say no more about it? Let me give you a stiff whiskey before you go. We're not supposed to drink while we're on duty, sir. Of course not, said Uncle Stephen. I have served with the police myself, in several different parts of the globe. A little later, when the three of them were sitting amicably together, Millie began to feel intensely sad. I cannot help feeling partially responsible, she blurted out. Do you think, Sergeant, there's anything to be done? Anything, even in theory, that I could do? Any possibility? At once Uncle Stephen shouted out, clap them in irons, I should hope. Use straitjackets, if necessary. Though you'd have to have them specially made big enough. And then you've got to lay hold of the boys first. Officer? They won the first round against me, you know. We'll manage that all right, sir, replied Detective Sergeant Metasweet. The police don't fancy having the mickey taken out of them by two overgrown kids. Which is what you and Mr. Mork both said they were, madam. But what can be done then? Persisted Millie, though somewhat against the grain, as she was perfectly well, although confusedly, aware. Is there anything that I could do? All I am permitted to say is that it will then be a matter for the proper authorities. The detective sergeant thought for a few seconds and, in his characteristic way, he added, I wish them the best of British luck with it. Unfortunately, it soon proved that the detective sergeant had been mistaken at the precise point where he had shown most confidence, his conviction that Angus and Rodney would be finally apprehended in virtually no time. A week passed and there was no hint or rumor of an arrest. On the other hand, Uncle Stephen had no further trouble with the authorities. There were questions at the next two parish council meetings, but nothing was permitted to come out of them. As for the two young giants themselves, they appeared to have gone into hiding, difficult though that must have been. Or perhaps it was that they were passing almost unnoticed amidst the freaks and zanies that people urban and suburban areas in the later part of the 20th century. Millie, however, remembering the pair, found that hard to believe and shivered when recollection fell for a while into full focus. Nonetheless, she had begun to go out once more, shopping, visiting the library, even attending a lecture on criminology by an Austrian refugee. Uncle Stephen was fiercely opposed to all these excursions, and, to please him, as she would have expressed it to a confidant, she gave two undertakings, that she would never be parted from a tiny gun he lent her, and that for any longer journey she would take his car and not lightly step out of it or turn off the engine. Before she was married, Millie had driven all the time. Uncle Stephen's car was a beautiful old Elvis. Millie loved muffling herself up in order to drive it, and it had the advantage that then she was not easily identifiable. The gun went into the pocket of her jeans, where it was no more noticeable than a compact. It fired special tiny bullets which, as Uncle Stephen confided, were, strictly speaking, illegal, a steady stream of them, if necessary, and it fired them almost silently. Uncle Stephen was at his best when instructing Millie on midweek mornings in the small orchard. These things were advances, and Millie had no doubt about how much Uncle Stephen loved and needed her, but the whole thing amounted to little more than a half-life, when all was said and done. Millie had no very precise idea of what the other half might consist in, still less of how best to go after it, but she missed it nonetheless, as people do. In the end, she decided finally that there was no sensible alternative to a further consultation with Thelma Modell. She had, of course, been aware of this for some time and had continued to dream about Thelma quite frequently, but it meant returning to the other suburb, the suburb where she had lived for years with Phineas and the boys, so that she had hesitated and hesitated. Uncle Stephen would have had a fit if he had known what she was proposing. Then one morning it became unbearable, as things suddenly do. It was a premonition or other compulsion. She tied up her hair in a dark green scarf, donned heavy-duty garments, and tucked in the ends of her knotted, paler green muffler, all without a word to Uncle Stephen except to the effect that she wanted some different air and would very likely die without it. It was not a very gracious thing to say, but it was essential to seem adamant. "Drive fast," said Uncle Stephen anxiously. "Never slow down unless you absolutely have to. And be ready for anything." She knew by now what that meant. "Of course, Uncle Stephen," she said. "I'll be fine. I ought by rights to come with you and look after you, but it's not safe to leave the house on its own. You know how it is, Millie." "I know. Luckily, I went over the car this morning while you were sleeping. She'll go like the wind." "See to it that she does. There's a girl." "That's what I'm going to do." She was tying an O'Donnell silk scarf round the lower part of her face. "Goodbye, my sweet." Through the tight scarf, Uncle Stephen kissed her lips. She roared away, but really there was a traffic light round the first bend, and always it was red. Uncle Stephen must have known that even better than she knew it. Nonetheless, she had a perfectly authentic disinclination to linger, and as the other suburb came nearer, one of her hands dropped half-consciously from the wheel and rested for longer and longer periods upon the reassuring object in her pocket. The parade, once again, the lavender bag, the fish shop. The fish shop was now even more diversified in its wares than when she had seen it last. Now there was hardly a fish in sight. Millie felt no nostalgia, nothing but nausea. She brought the Alvis to rest as unobtrusively as possible with such a machine and darted upstairs in her full rig. She had no more made an appointment than on the previous occasion. But this time the visionary did not greet her upon the landing, and the door of the sanctum, once the rheumatism lady's little sitting room, was shut. Millie hesitated for some time. After all, she was presumably hidden from observation and could give a moment or two to thinking and deciding. Most probably, Thelma's practice had grown since those first days, so that by now a client would have to be specially fitted in. Alternatively, Thelma might have failed and gone. Or gone anyway. Communities are full of neat or braggart labels referring to vanished enterprises. Millie timidly tapped. "What is it?" The voice was Thelma's. How could Millie explain? It was best to open and enter. Thelma sat on the floor by the rheumatism lady's miniature gas fire. The black table, with its attendant black chairs, had been pushed into a corner. The zodiacal wall cards hung at madder angles than ever. Thelma herself wore what looked like the same green jeans, though they also looked a year and more older, and a battle-dress tunic, dyed dark blue by the authorities. It could be deduced that business was less than brisk. "Oh, it's you." Thelma did not get up, and this time it was Millie who stood. "Yes, it's me. I want to know what's happening now." "Exactly, please. What's happening at this very moment, if possible?" "Well, in that case you'd better shut the door." Millie complied. She perceived that she should have done it in the first place. At least Thelma had not specifically demurred. "And you'd better take off your clothes." "Some of them," said Millie, smiling. She had unwound the silk scarf from her face before entering. Now she climbed out of the heavy-duty garments and threw them on the floor, where they lay like prehistoric monsters, alive or dead, as the case might be. The rheumatism lady had presumably arranged to take away her carpets since Millie had last been there, because now the boards were bare. They were also mottled, but that happened soon and mysteriously in almost any house. "Leave that," said Thelma sharply, as Millie was about to unwind the dark green scarf which confined her locks. Millie desisted. Her brow was moist. "Take off your sweater if you're too hot," said Thelma. Millie shook her head. "This time I shall need your money," said Thelma. "You can't depend entirely on my goodwill. I might need a new dress." "Have you thought of that?" "How much money?" asked Millie, still on her feet. "How much have you got with you?" "Can't you see without asking me?" "Yes," said Thelma. £40 in fivers and 10 single pounds. "You must want to know badly." "I do," said Millie calmly. For some reason, Thelma, no matter what her words or deeds, never upset her as so many people did, even when saying or doing very little. Thelma was like Uncle Stephen in that. I'll take 49 pounds of it. You may need a pound suddenly when you leave. Millie had noticed before that Thelma was surprisingly well-spoken in her own way. Only if you tell me what I've asked you to tell me and tell me the truth and the whole truth. Thelma shot Millie a confusing glance. Though intense, it was not necessarily hostile. Then she arose from the floor and drew the curtains across the single window. They were not the rheumatism lady's pretty chintz, but heavy, dun, and unshaped. As they were touched and moved, they smelt. It was as if old clothes were being draped before the fairy windows of a wagon. Thelma locked the door. I'm not locking you in. You can leave any time you like. And Millie could indeed see that the key was still there. Thelma lifted the crystal and placed it on the floor. Sure enough, it was much smaller than Millie had always supposed such gadgets to be. Perhaps they came in different sizes, according to the purchaser's needs and resources? The only light was from under the door and from the small yellow gas fire. The room was odorous as well as stuffy. Thelma signalized this fact by throwing off her dark blue tunic. Beneath it she wore a fragile pinkish garment with big rents in it, through which her brown skin could be seen by what light there was. Her mop of hair was uncombed and uneven in length. Do what I am doing, directed Thelma, and added, if you really must go on with this. When Millie made no answer, Thelma wriggled down on the floor until she lay at full length upon her front with the crystal about 2 inches before her eyes. She looked ridiculous, or any other woman in her position would have looked ridiculous. Millie had supposed that crystal gazing was done seated at a table. Moreover, a very suitable table was in the room with them. I advised you to take off your sweater, said Thelma. Why not be more friendly? Millie continued calm. Upon the passage to truth, cross-currents are to be expected. I'm all right, she said, and lay down upon her front on the diametrical other side of the small crystal. She rested her chin upon her 2 hands, as Thelma was doing. At these close quarters, Thelma's lupin aroma was very pungent. Millie tried to concentrate upon gazing into the crystal. She assumed that to be the right thing to do. If only the crystal had been proportioned for a mature woman instead of for a waif. But that matter began to adjust itself, and before Millie had had time even to begin feeling physically uncomfortable. As she gazed through the crystal at Thelma's rockpool eyes, the yellow light from the gas fire turned blue, and the circumference of the crystal expanded and expanded, as did Thelma's orbs on the other side of it. Indeed, Millie realized quite clearly that it must always have been impossible for her to have seen Thelma's eyes through the actual crystal. All anyone could really have seen through it would have been Thelma's nose and a small distance on either side of it. Incandescent with darting blue lights, the crystal grew until it filled the room, until it was the room, and Thelma's eyes were no longer there, as if her face had split vertically down the middle and her eyes had rolled away round the polished sphere, each in a different direction. But by now Millie was in a room no longer. Nor was she lying inconveniently upon her front. On the contrary, she was in a small woodland clearing and was observing with perfect ease what therein transpired. The 2 boys were sitting, rather absurdly jammed together, on a tree trunk. It was not a whole fallen giant of the forest, but a neatly sawn-off section, awaiting the arrival of the timber float and its tractor, or perhaps left there by intention as a nature seat for wooers, an accessory to picnics. In fact, the boys, ravenous as ever, were at that moment engaged upon a picnic of their own. Each boy held in his hand a very large, very red bone, from which he was gnawing in the frenzied manner that Millie remembered so well. On the worn, wintry grass before them lay what was left of a human body. The boys had already eaten their way through most of it, so that it could not even be described as a skeleton or semi-skeleton. The disjoined bones were everywhere strewn about at random, and only the top part of the frame, the upper ribs, remained in position, together with the half-eaten head. It was Phineas's head. Things swam. Millie felt that her soul was rushing up a shaft at the center of her body. She knew that this is what it was to die. But she did not die. She realized that now she was lying on her back in the still darkened room. Thelma must have moved her. The gas fire was as yellow as before, no doubt because there was something wrong with it, and Thelma in her pink rags and dirty jeans was standing before her, even looking down at her. You've been out a long time. I wish I were still out. You may, but I don't. I've things to do. You forget that. Millie hesitated. Did you see them too? Of course I saw them. Remember, I asked you whether you really had to go on with it. What else could I do? I don't know. I'm not your nursemaid. Millie sat up. If you pass me my handbag, I'll pay you. Thelma passed it. It did not seem to have been rifled during Millie's anesthesia. Perhaps we could have a little more light, suggested Millie. Thelma threw on her tunic and, without fastening it, began to draw back or take down the window coverings. Millie did not examine which it was. She rose to her feet. Had Thelma been behaving differently, Millie, would have been shaking all over, still prostrate. She seated herself on one of the dusty black chairs. She counted out 49 pounds onto the black table in the corner. Then she gazed for a moment straight into Thelma's vatic eyes. At once the sensations of a few moments before, or of what seemed a few moments, faintly recurred. Millie felt dragged out of herself and turned her face to the dingy wall. You can stay if you wish. You know that. Thelma made no attempt to take up the money, though Millie could be in small doubt that the sum would make a big difference for Thelma, at least temporarily. You can't expect me to keep open house for you always. Millie turned a little and, without again looking at Thelma, attempted a smile of some kind. I shan't be around much longer, said Thelma. Surely you can see that. Millie stood up. Where will you go? I shall go back to decent people. I should never have left them. What made you? I killed a girl. I see. I did right. There was a pause, a need, perhaps on both sides, for inner regrouping. It was a metaphor that Uncle Stephen might have approved. Millie gathered herself together. Is that the sort of thing I ought to do? How can I tell? Why ask me? You must decide for yourself. Millie gathered herself together a second time. It was difficult to petition. The 49 pounds still lay untouched on the hocus-pocus table. You can tell, Thelma. I know you can. They're obscene, monstrous, all those words. You know as well as I do. You're the only one who does. I feel responsible for them. Is that what I ought to do? Tell me. Thelma seemed actually to reflect for a moment, instead of darting out a reply like the double tongue of a snake, the flick of a boxing seconds towel, as she usually did. You're not the kind, said Thelma. It would be beyond you. Then what? Help me, Thelma. Please, please help me. I told you before. Run away. Millie stared blankly at the entire, round, empty world. Be more friendly and you can lie up with me. I keep saying so. But soon I shan't be here. I have debts. Millie wondered with what currency Thelma proposed to settle. Hurry up and put the money away somewhere, Millie said. But Thelma again spoke to the point. I'll place my right hand on your heart and you'll place your on mine. Then we'll be friends. Millie glanced at Thelma's ragged pink garment, but all she said was, it wouldn't be fair. Then she added, thank you all the same. What a depraved, common way to express gratitude, she thought. There was a tapping at the locked door. Who's that? Asked Millie, as if she really did live there. Thelma had leapt upon the money like a cheetah and shoved it hugger-mugger into her jeans. It's Agnes Waterfield. She comes every day at this hour. God. I don't want to meet her, cried Millie. Well, you'll have to, said Thelma, and unlocked the door on the instant. Millie could only snatch her garments and scuttle away like a cat, hoping that Agnes might be too involved in her own troubles and preoccupations to recognize her, though not really believing it. Outside, it had begun to snow. The big open car was spattered with separate flakes. Millie sped away. Soon the suburb, which had once been home, was miles behind. The straggling and diminishing woodlands touched the road at several places before one reached the main section in which lay Uncle Stephen's house. The ground was hummocky here, and nowadays the road ran through several small cuttings, 10 or 12 feet high, in order to maintain a more or less constant level for the big lorries, and to give the tearaway tourists an illusion for a minute or two that they were traversing the Rocky Mountains. There were even bends in the road which had not yet been straightened, and all the trees in sight were conifers. Thinking only of sanctuary, Millie tore round one of these bends, much too fast, but almost everyone did it, and few with Millie's excellent reason, and there were the two boys blocking the way, tall as Fiona MacLeod's lordly ones, muscular as Gog Magog, rising high above the puny banks of earth. It was a busy road, and they could only a moment before have dropped down into it. Beneath the snow patches on their clothing, Millie could clearly see the splashes of blood from their previous escapade. The boys were so placed that Millie had to stop. "Got any grub, Mum?" Quite truthfully, she could no longer tell one twin from the other. "That's all we ask, Mum," said the other twin. "We're hungry." "We don't want to outgrow our strength," said the first twin, just as in the old days. "Let's search," cried the second twin. Forbearance was extinguished by appetite. The two boys were now on the same side of the car. Millie, who had never seen herself as a glamorous mistress of the wheel, managed something that even Uncle Stephen might have been proud of in the old, dead days at Brooklands. She wrenched the car round onto the other side of the highway, somehow evaded the towering French truck charging towards her, swept back to her proper lane, and was fast on her way. But there was such a scream, perhaps two such screams, that, despite herself, she once more drew up. She looked back. The snow was falling faster now, even beginning to lie on the car floor. She was 200 or 300 yards from the accident. What accident? She had to find out. It would be better to drive back rather than to walk. Even in the modern world, the authorities would not yet have had time to appear and close the road. Again Millie wheeled. The two vast figures lay crushed on the highway. They had been standing locked together gazing after her, after the car in which there might have been sweets or biscuits, so that in death, as in life, they were not divided. They had been killed by a police vehicle, naturally one of the heavier models. Millie had underestimated the instancy of modernity. The thing stood there, bluely lighted and roaring. "It was you we were after, miss," remarked the police officer, as soon as Millie came once more to a standstill. All the police were ignoring the snow completely. "You were speeding. And now look what's happened. If you ask Detective Sergeant Meadowsweet, he will explain to you why I was going fast." Millie shivered. "I have to go fast. We shall make inquiries, but no individual officer is empowered to authorize a breach of the law." By the time the usual particulars had been given and taken, the ambulance had arrived, screaming and flashing with determination, but it was proving impossible to insert the two huge bodies into it. The men were doing all they could, and the police had surrounded the area with neat little objects, like bright toys, but anyone not immediately involved could see that the task was hopeless. The snow was falling more heavily every minute, so that by the time Millie was once more left alone among the traffic surging round the frail barrier, the two boys were looking like the last scene in Babes in the Wood, except that the babes had changed places and changed roles with the giants.